Ladies and gentlemen, today on the program, bit of a dropped wedding cake, actually, but we're going to talk a little music, we're going to talk a little travel, and we're going to talk a little history, and you don't need a super long preamble for that, so what say we just get to the show? Hey, Denny boy, roll intro! Denny. Roll an intro over here. Denny boy, roll intro. Must be working on his bus. Okay, let's see. I'll have to do it. So is it, yeah. Is it that button? Whoa! No, not that one. Oh yeah, okay. This one. Here we go. I like that one. Now, let's see. Is it, yep, this one. Oh, crap. Hello. You're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. So am I the only one who felt that? I thought I was done with Saturday Night Live. Like, I thought with the church lady, it was over for me. It's like you kind of attached to Saturday Night Live in the period that was your high school years. And I thought it was over, but I think a lot of people tuned into Saturday Night Live on the weekend, on the day that Joe Biden was kind of affirmed as the president-elect, and he had the rally and he had the speeches. It was that day, you know, on that day, Dave Chappelle was hosting Saturday Night Live, and I think a lot of people wanted to tune in to hear what he would have to say at the downfall of a regime that was so linked with racism and division and a lot of the stuff that Dave Chappelle talks about. I think a lot of people tuned in because they wanted to hear what he would say about that. An astute choice for host that weekend. And I think Dave expressed a lot of the anger, you know, that's been kind of floating around. And I think he did that. But for me, the really profound moment, the emotionally profound moment came when the Foo Fighters stepped up for their second performance of the night and they played Times Like These. What a perfect choice for a song. And it didn't occur to me until Dave Grohl started singing. Now, that's a banging tune, the single, but they did it in a way that says they knew. They knew that this was a moment, and they chose this song very deliberately, and they played that first kind of verse chorus, basically just Dave singing with a bit of keyboard behind him, very soft, very subtle. It's times like these you learn to live again. It's times like these you give and give again. It's times like these you learn to love again. It's times like these, time and time again. And isn't that the most profound and appropriate thing for all of us to think about? As, you know, Biden was coming in, and that day Biden was coming in, we'd all just kind of watched the Biden celebration, you know. And after 4 years of the Trump administration, and after a year of coronavirus, I personally hadn't really realized how much weight there was attached to all that, how much heaviness there's been. The last year, yeah, coronavirus, yeah, I felt that, but it's like when Dave Grohl started singing those words. I'm a one-way motorway, I'm the one that drives away, then follows you back home. I'm a street light shining, I'm a wild light blinding, bright, burning off alone. There was this sort of wistfulness and this catharsis in the way that was sung and in that presentation, and it just kind of really struck me, man. It's been a heavy time. The air, the energy, the atmosphere has been so heavy. And it was Foo Fighters, of all people, who for me delivered the profound emotional note of this whole experience, this whole election. And there was just kind of a moment of release, and poignancy when you were like, man, it's been hard. The year has been hard. The 4 years have been hard. Mentally, emotionally, it's been so heavy. And it's been so dark. And it felt like New Year's Eve. Like we were waiting after the Biden speeches and after the Harris speech. We had to wait a couple hours for the ball to drop, That's kind of how it is on New Year's Eve. You're awaiting this moment to come at midnight. And that's a moment of renewal. That's a moment of clean slate. New Year's Day is my favorite day of the year. And New Year's Eve is the anticipation of that. And Saturday night felt like that to me. But what we were waiting for was Chappelle to lower the boom on the Trump administration. And in fact, it was the Foo Fighters who made the statement. It's times like these you learn to love again. And wasn't that the message? Wasn't that President-elect Biden's message of reconciliation after so many years of division? And I get it. I'm a Canadian, okay? This is not my country. This is not my election. But, we're global now, man. We're all connected. And, especially in Canada, America has such presence. We are the mouse sleeping on top of the elephant. When the elephant moves, we go for a ride, okay? And so we felt that here. And everybody has felt the coronavirus. And I think, I can't speak for other parts of the world, but I know that there's division here. Mask, no mask, open up, don't open up, lockdown, don't lock down. There's a division here about that. There's enormous division in the United States that runs deeper than I think a lot of us looking in from the outside even realized. And it's heavy. And the last 4 years have been incredibly divisive and angry and despairing. And coronavirus put the cherry on top of that, but it's like a cherry bomb. And the bomb might have gone off and blown the whole thing wide open. And there were some of us who only half jokingly wondered whether a civil war might follow the results of this election. And to be fair, we haven't seen what the fallout's going to be. But for one night, for one evening, it was New Year's Eve, man. And it felt like a renewal and it felt like starting over. And when Dave Grohl sang those words, quietly, emotionally, I just felt the heaviness of the world in a way that I really hadn't recognized until then. And then they burst into the song For Real, and that kind of felt like a release too, and there was a bit of a celebration. And I don't know, man, that's what music can do. Those of us who are drawn to music in that kind of emotional way, it's always the emotional music that gets me. Whether that emotion is happiness or sadness or anger or release or joy or whatever, if there's an emotional component to it, that's what gets me. And last night, Dave Grohl and the Foo Fighters delivered that in a profound way, in a poignant moment. And that was exceptionally well done. I had a whole other show recorded. This is the risk you take, okay? When you record a show that you don't intend to release for a few days, things can change, things can come up, things that are worth talking about in the interim. Like a new president gets elected. Now, literally, when I sat down to record on Saturday morning, I hit the button, and it was 2:53 to 2:13 for Biden, like it had been for days. And by the time I got done recording, there was a new president. That's a sea change, man. That changes the context of everything. And it's hard to know what to do because you can re-record, but the initial impetus, the sort of spark in whatever you discussed, gets lost a little bit if you try to do it again. So we're going to just splice in, kids, because I was talking about Vienna and how much I love Vienna and what an awful thing happened there last week that nobody talks about because of the election. So I'm going to cut in on that, and then I'm going to let it run from there. We're going to talk a little bit about Remembrance Day and the First World War and my sort of fascination with that. And there may be stuff that appears out of context because what came before it is no longer in the episode. Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to find out. But that's a fun game, you know? So if you feel some cognitive dissonance, if you feel the ground wobble beneath your perceptual feet, it's probably because some of what came before is no longer there. Some of the context might be missing. But what I had to say is important, so I'm going to let that run from here, and I'm going to let it run on out. And I hope you enjoy. Here we go. I've said it before on this show. You've heard me say it. If you've been to my website, you've seen me write about it. You've read it. Vienna is the most magnificent city I've ever been to. I haven't been everywhere, all right? But I've seen a few places, and Vienna is just such a magnificent city. And it hurts me to know that a nutcase gunman went running around Vienna shooting people. And it's doubly substantial and doubly significant for me because I have a very good friend who is a regular listener to this show who lives in Vienna, and I know it shook her up really bad, and I feel awful for her. But I want to tell her and everybody else that Vienna is amazing. And I've only been there one time, and I only spent a few hours, to be honest, but a few hours is enough to know that that is a special city, man. Now, it was 2017. On the road with Sarah Smith in Europe, and we had a show booked in Vienna. Talked about this on the last episode. Talked about Anna at the bar in Vienna and the strange people you meet along the way, which is what makes touring so great. We had a show there at this really nice club. It was our first time touring in Europe, so it was kind of the first, not Sarah's, but the full band's first tour in Europe. So it's like you're trying to pull an audience, you know? It's how it works. For those of us who don't spend a lot of time on the radio or when they used to have videos on the MTV, the way you build an audience is you play, and then you come back around and you play again, and then you come back around, play again, and you sort of you accrue an audience, you snowball an audience. One fan at a time, you know, and that fan tells somebody else, and that fan tells somebody else, and you keep going around and around in circles, and so you begin by playing to 20 people at a nice little club. And then you hope in a few years, 20 has become 100 or 200 or 400. And that's just the way it is. It's the way it used to be. It's the way it is now for some of us. So it was our first sojourn into Vienna. We've not been back, and we need to. I cannot wait to go back to Vienna. We played this great little show in this great little club, and it was cool. And then, you know, driving into town. This was in November, you know, darkness falls early, but we were driving from Kutna Hora, Czech Republic, which is another story all on its own, but a reasonably long drive from Czech Republic into Austria, you know, past Prague, which is another amazing city that I hope to dig into at some point in time. We were driving into Vienna and night was falling, so it was, you know, it wasn't late, it was early evening, but it was dark, but you could tell just driving in, even in the dark, kind of in the outer rim, you know, in the suburbs, driving in, you're like, this city is special. Even in the dark, you could see the lights and you could see the buildings that are so old and so, it's a movie set. Vienna's a movie set, and it's just, it's mind-blowing. We got there and we played our show, and then we had our little after party and Anna at the bar, and that just really cool experience. And we stayed in this band house. When they tell you you're staying at the band house, you brace for the worst, man. And I've talked about that before too. But the place they put us up in Vienna, which was I don't know if it was actually upstairs from the venue or if it was like around the corner. It was attached. In any case, wow. This would have been one of the nicest hotels I've ever stayed at, with these huge, like, I don't know, 15-foot ceilings and drapes and these just wonderful accommodations. European accommodations, in our experience at least, have been so good. It's such a treat to play shows there. I want to live in Europe, by the way. If you guys can facilitate me living in Europe, I am very much open to suggestion on that. And so the next day we had some time, and it's like, having time on the road is quite a rarity, especially for us. Now, if you're in a like a bus band, you're playing a little bit bigger shows and you can afford a bus, here's what happens is you play your show and you come off stage. And you probably have a little crew that cleans up stage, packs up all the instruments, and you kind of go and you might shower at the venue, maybe. And most times you're going to get on your bus and you're going to hang out there, and then you're going to go to sleep, and the bus is going to drive off to the next city, right? Sometimes you have a hotel you stay. A lot of times you get on the bus and you drive to the next city. And we don't have that. In some ways luxury, in some ways inconvenience. So we have a van that we drive, right? We pack up our own gear. We are an indie band touring small and self-contained and lean, man. You got to be lean to save the money when you're touring at that level. So for us, it's get done the show, pack up all the gear, put it in the van, and then go to the hotel and sleep. Right? And the next day you drive. You don't drive overnight to the next venue. You go to the hotel and sleep. And so we did that. And the next morning we had like 3 or 4 hours where we could poke around Vienna. And 3 or 4 of the great hours of my life, man. If you're a history person, get thee to Vienna, Austria. Get thee to Wien, Österreich. All right? Because it's, how do I even describe it? I'm a man of words with words too insubstantial to describe that city. So we get up and we got on like public transit. I want to say it was a subway. I don't remember if it even was, man. Things become a blur. You're in so many different cities, but I do remember distinctly coming up out of an underground. All right. So we came in from our hotel in the burbs and coming up from the underground into a fantasy. You get kind of downtown, the heart, the ancient part of Vienna, which is 1,200, 1,300 years ago is when they started building this. We're talking about Romans here. Like, it goes back a long, long way. And I remember distinctly, we came up out of the underground almost directly beneath the tallest spire on St. Stephen's Cathedral. Now, this is a Gothic cathedral, the original foundations of which date to like 1137. We're talking nearly 1,000 years ago, all right? And this spire is over 400 feet high, and it's Gothic, and it's like Lord of the Rings stuff, man. And we pop up out of the underground beneath this thing, and your jaw kind of hits your boots. And it's a whole pedestrian mall for blocks, right? It's just like cobblestone and this ancient building and people walking and talking. At the time, it was November. So like the Christmas decorations are up everywhere. It's a movie set, man. It's a movie set. And you can picture Mozart walking those streets. And you can picture Sigmund Freud walking those streets. And Beethoven. And Thomas Vanek, who used to play for the beloved Montreal Canadiens. And you just walk around. I had this experience, 5 years ago, where I was touring out west of Canada, and I went through the mountains for the first time, right? The Rocky Mountains. And the way it works in the Rocky Mountains is you follow the highway, and around every corner, you see what you think is the greatest sight you'll ever see in your life. You wheel around a corner, and there's a mountain in front of you that is so majestic, and the sun is on it, and you look at it and go, that's the most incredible sight I've ever seen in my freaking life. And then you go around another corner, and you see a better one. And then a better one, and then a better one, and your mind begins to blow, right? You start to twitch a little bit, and your finger gets sore from hitting the picture button. Now, that was me then. I try to take fewer pictures now because I want to make mental pictures. I want to experience things as they come, not look at them later, because no matter how good a photographer you are, The photo of the mountain is never going to be as good as the mountain itself. Well, Vienna is like that. So you walk up and you see the spire. It's tough to beat St. Stephen's Cathedral, I'm not going to lie to you. But you see that and your jaw hits your boots and you look at it and go, what? Because you come from the New World like we do. We don't tend to have stuff like that. Or even nothing here we can look at that dates back 1,000 years. And then you walk around the corner and then there's just like a row of buildings. And they're old and beautiful and connected. And the streets it's people walking. And the buildings are so old. And there goes Mozart. Your jaw just hurts from banging off the cobblestones. You know what I'm saying? And the Christmas decorations were all up. And just around, it's just miles of corridors and streets. And these beautiful old buildings that are all kind of connected, right? And then there'd be like, there's a palace, the Hofburg Palace there, which was kind of the seat of power for the Habsburgs for, I don't know how long the Habsburgs ruled Austria, but it ended in the First World War. And it's like ancient and magnificent. Magnificent is the word. Vienna is magnificent. Previous to Vienna, my favorite city on planet Earth was Paris. All right, I've been to Paris a couple different times, and I love Paris. But it's not kind of the touristy downtown Paris that I love so much. It's outside of that. And it's the buildings that you're walking around in the 1700s, you know, or older. And it's everywhere you go. It's so charming and old. And there's a vibe in Paris that I just really, really love. I love Paris. And we haven't had a chance to play there yet, but I hope someday that happens. And I've never noticed the French people to be rude and awful either, by the way. They've been very, very polite to me when I've been there. And it helps that my wife speaks pretty good French. But I don't know. If you've not been to Paris, you need to go to Paris and just spend a few days there and go to the Louvre and look at the Arc de Triomphe and try to just watch the traffic around there. My goodness. Then you think of pictures of Hitler marching through there. It's like being in Europe, being amongst so much history, so much significant, profound history. Berlin was like that too. Or we go to places like Braunschweig where, you know, you can find pictures of Hitler holding rallies in front of the palace there where you're getting like a donair across the street now, but it's like, yeah, there's photos, Hitler, the big guy, you know, and you know, Vienna too. And then you just picture all the history and it's amazing. And Paris is like that. And you can picture Hemingway and the Lost Generation. It's like just being in that vibe is so cool. But Paris was my favorite place until I got to Vienna. And I'm still in awe. 3 years later, almost exactly 3 years later, still in utter awe of Vienna. And it hurts me that something so awful happened there last week. The other thing about Vienna is, you know, we had a mission. We had 2 missions. One was just to look at this place because the city is just breathtaking. The other was to get some coffee, man. Now, when we touched down, we're all coffee people. Now, when we touched down in Europe the first time, the game was on. Who's got the best coffee? Because we're all coffee people, right? And coffee is an art form in Europe. And we had just had a magnificent cup in Kutna Hora that morning. Kutna Hora, Czech Republic, is this tiny town, most famous for the Bone Cathedral, the Bone Church, inside of which are the remains of about 40,000 people, most of whom died in the Middle Ages from bubonic plague, all right? Very relevant to today, actually. We have our own little plague to deal with, but I doubt they're going to put anybody in an ancient church and turn it into an art exhibit of skulls and bones. Super duper creepy, man, but wow, something to see. And look up the Bone Cathedral, the Sedlec Ossuary in Kutna Hora, Czech Republic. About an hour and a half from Prague, right? Probably everything's about an hour and a half from Prague in the Czech Republic. Anyways, we left the Bone Cathedral that morning after playing Kutna Hora the previous night, and right down the street was a little Turkish coffee place, right? No, I gotta get the Turkish coffee, man, in this little town in the Czech Republic. We had the coffee and it was great. Strong, packed a punch, but not bitter, not harsh, you know what I mean? strong coffee can be really harsh, and particularly in North America when you order yourself a coffee, a lot of times it tastes like dishwater. A lot of times it's so thin as to cause you to question whether it even is coffee. And then if you get a strong one, a lot of times it's just bitter and it's harsh, and it's not over there. It's an art form, man. So we had these little cups of Turkish coffee in Kutna Hora, Czech Republic that were just dynamite. Then we drove to Vienna and jaws hitting the ground. And the next morning we're off on a quest to see if Austrian coffee can top Czech Republic coffee. We'd also had Dutch coffee, which was dynamite as well. So we're wandering around Vienna. Christmas season, the lights are up, people walking everywhere in this kind of pedestrian mall. Europe is great at pedestrian malls. I love that about Europe, man. I love town squares, and I love pedestrian malls, and I love cobblestone streets, and I just love the ancientness of it. For me, as a history person, it's almost too much to take. Your head starts to buzz a little bit. Eventually, we settle on a cafe, of which there are thousands, in downtown Vienna, and in downtown Paris, and in Lippstadt, Germany, and in Berlin, and in Den Haag, Netherlands. There are coffee shops, man, because they understand how to do leisure. Europeans understand how to sit down on a workday and have a cup of coffee. We could learn a lot from that, man. I can't tell you how many towns we've gone to in Europe where we get there and we set up and we got a little bit of time to kill. It's rare, but we have time to kill, and we just sort of go wandering around. And there will be a town square everywhere, and there'll be tables set outside, little patios, and there'll just be people at all of them drinking coffee or drinking a beer or whatever. It's like, don't you people have jobs? It's like, yeah, we're having a coffee. It's like, we need that. We need coffee culture in a way that they do it over there. So, I mean, which coffee shop are you going to pick in Vienna? They're all great. We go to this place. It was packed. And we sat down to what remains the best cup of coffee we've had. So if you can't be recommended to Vienna on the strength of its history and charm and unbelievable beauty, go for the coffee, man. You will not regret the Viennese coffee. Now, we have not yet gone to Italy to try their coffee, and I know that's going to be like a heavyweight contender for the coffee weight championship of Europe. Eventually we will, south of France, Spain. Does Spain do good coffee? I don't know. I think everywhere in Europe does coffee well. We had good coffee in Germany. We had it in the Netherlands. I've had good coffee in Belgium. I've had good coffee in Paris. I have sat at a great little cafe right down in the heart of Paris and had a croissant and a wonderful cup of coffee. Man, and if you have had that experience, you are living a privileged life, and I am extremely lucky. So this is just my little ode to Vienna. An awful thing happened there last week, and it scared the city, as it should have. And that's been overshadowed by the gong show down south. And I'm not sure Donald Trump is worth overshadowing what happened in Vienna. So all my love to the Vienna people, and I cannot wait to come back, hopefully to come back and play for you. If not, just to come back and sit down for a day or two in your magnificent city, enjoy a wonderful cup of coffee, and just look at one of the most breathtaking places that humankind has created. Now, speaking of Paris, the first time I went to Paris, I got engaged there. And you can hear that story on one of the roadisodes I did with Ken and Denny, where somehow we got into telling our engagement stories, and it's very romantic, and it'll warm your cockles, and you might want to go and listen to that. I don't remember which episode it was, but one of them. Anyways, first time I went, I was in university, and My family stumped up to give me the money to go to meet my then girlfriend, who was studying for a year in France, in the fine city of Nantes, which is beautiful. And we spent some time in Paris when we got engaged there, and that was wonderful. On an empty subway car in Paris. Now, how hip and indie and cool is that? Second time I went was 2008. And I was there as part of a pilgrimage that I took that year to visit First World War sites in northern France and Belgium. And I'm telling you that right now because tomorrow is Remembrance Day, kids. If you're listening to this on release day, tomorrow is Remembrance Day, and that's a big one for me. I have always respected Remembrance Day because I'm a First World War guy, okay? You've heard me talk about this before too, and it comes into focus this time of year. And 2008, I made a pilgrimage. Now, my dream trip, a lot of people say, my dream trip is to go to wherever. My dream trip is a bit of a strange one. My dream trip was to spend some time poking around the Somme and Passchendaele and Ypres, Belgium, the arsehole of the First World War. And I did that in 2008. Did all the planning, and we spent 2 weeks in France and Belgium with a side trip to Den Haag. And the first part of that, this is the deal. My wife, in order to be convinced to do this, okay, we can have a week for you, man. We also need a week where I'm not standing in some of the creepiest and most diabolical pieces of landscape in the world, which is northern France and Belgium in the First World War. So the agreement was we would do a week of my stuff, and then we would do a week where we went to Paris, and we spent a couple days in London, and we zipped over, as I said, to Den Haag, Netherlands, where our dear friend Helen lives. Helen, who we met when we were living in Japan many, 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 many years ago. She was a teacher there. My wife was a teacher there. So we side-tripped to Den Haag, which is another... We haven't played a show in Den Haag, and we need to, because Den Haag is just a wonderful city. There are so many wonderful cities, man! But Paris was part of our trip when we went over there to do my dream trip, which is to traipse around cemeteries and stand beside shell craters in the northern part of France and around Ypres and Passchendaele, Belgium. And I mention that today because it's important. And Remembrance Day is important. And I know there's a whole thing going down with Whole Foods right now banning the poppy. I'm not getting into the politics of this. But you may be wondering, you're probably wondering, where this came from, this fascination of mine with the First World War. And, I owe a lot of it to Charlie Brown. Last week was Halloween, which is another favorite time of the year of mine. My two overriding favorite days are probably Halloween and New Year's Day. When I was a little kid, you remember this? Do you remember Charlie Brown? Do you remember It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown? If you're my age, and you probably are, you probably remember this fondly from your youth. I don't know if they still show that anymore. I don't know if kids watch this kind of thing anymore. My friend Mark told me that maybe they were showing it at the drive-in as a prelude to some movies for kids on Halloween. I hope so, because it's a classic, man. But it takes this bizarre turn where Charlie Brown and the gang are putting together a Halloween party. Let's bob for apples. Lucy, such a charming child. And there's this whole sideline where Snoopy, who is dressed as a World War I flying ace with the helmet and the scarf and no pants, they follow Snoopy on this weird journey where he's in his Sopwith camel, which is his doghouse, and he's fighting the Red Baron himself, Manfred von Richthofen. Van Richthofen. I'm working on the Deutsch, and I'm sure my pronunciations are not great. But the Red Baron was a real thing, was a real person, Baron Manfred von Richthofen, World War I flying ace. The Red Baron's flying circus. That's what these colorful planes would come over, and the Red Baron would be in the lead. Anyways, Snoopy, British pilot, I guess, or maybe they were calling him American, was fighting Baron von Richthofen. You remember this from The Great Pumpkin? Side note, World War I was such a bizarre and cruel and sad conflict. But there was this weird chivalry about the war that I don't think ever existed after it. Maybe it did. The First World War was 19th century tactics against 20th century weapons, and that's why the carnage, kids. But there was this weird sort of camaraderie between the armies in the line. There was this sense of a shared experience. Our guys, their guys, the other guy's guys. We're all in this together, and none of them wanted to be. And the Germans and the British and the French, and they would kind of look at each other across the lines, especially in the early kind of years of the war. Be like, I got no quarrel with you, you got no quarrel with me. I don't know why we're here, man. This is a shared misery, and it's horrendous. But there was this devotion to duty and this sort of old ideas about empire and I don't know, there was a different frame of mind amongst those people. I hear it debated often whether people from the modern day would consent to be part of something like that. Like, how long would you hang in those trenches? Like, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? The people in those days thought that too, and they shared a camaraderie with the other side because of this shared misery. But they never... Can't say never. There was some mutiny in the French ranks, and there was some mutiny towards the end of Russia's involvement too. And for good reason, because it's chaos. It's a lunatic asylum. It's the most insane thing that I think human beings have ever undertaken to do willingly together. World War II is a much different thing. World War II is a much more us versus them, good versus evil, Nazis, much different sort of ethos around that. World War I was what Dan Carlin in his magnificent podcast series, Blueprint for Armageddon, which you should be listening to, called a charnel house of horrors. And it was, all right? I don't remember how I got onto this or where I was going. When you off the cuff this stuff, sometimes your cuff flies off, you know what I'm saying? So we had Snoopy in this weird sideline fighting the Red Baron and getting shot down, and then crawling through the French countryside. And what lingers in my mind is the animation on those sequences, and the sky in particular. And Snoopy is like sneaking through the French countryside looking for Allied lines to save himself. And there's like flashes of bombs going off in the distance. And this, to me, I think it probably looked a lot like that. And it probably felt a lot like that. And Charles Schulz and the animation team on that, even in the 60s, captured this vibe that little tiny pumpkinhead me, watching this on TV, just grabbed onto. There was something utterly compelling about it, about the way it looked, you know? And I don't know why. I do not know the thinking behind this sideline in the Halloween special. But it's such a weird diversion. But for me, it was a hook. And I wanted to know more about this. I wanted to know more about this atmosphere that they had created. And then the second kind of nail in my historical coffin was a movie released in 1979 for television. And it was a remake of All Quiet on the Western Front. Do you know All Quiet on the Western Front? This was a book initially written by a former German soldier, Erich Remarque. Probably not saying that right either, but he experienced the First World War and he came back, as most people did, utterly disillusioned and changed by the experience. You know, they marched off to war singing songs about the fatherland in Germany and the empire and king and empire, you know, amongst the Canadians and the British, etc. Vive la France. And they sort of marched off to this grand adventure together. And very, very quickly after, they realized, oh, this is no grand adventure. And this is not going to end by Christmas. Though it should have. It should have. Because somebody sane in the maelstrom that was the first few months of the war, the end of 1914, where people went down by the tens of thousands because they were enacting 18th century tactics against 19th century, well, probably 18th century too. 19th century tactics against 20th century weapons. That means mass formations of men marching across open fields into machine gun fire and overwhelming artillery. And it was carnage, man. And somebody should have stopped that. And, the sort of camaraderie between sides was expressed in the winter truce, right? The Christmas truce of 1914, where Christmas came and the men of both sides, English, French, German, came out of the trenches and stood in no man's land together and shared cigarettes and chocolate and played football. And it was like there was no enmity. There was no animosity between them. They were like, what are we doing here, man? Can we get out of here? I don't know, can we? And this sort of thing gave rise, by the way, to communist movements and socialist movements, where the workers, the poor people, the people in the lines started talking to each other about who put us here and why do we not have the power to stop this, I mean, it all stems from the First World War, man. And somebody should have stopped it, and they didn't. So Eric Remarker wrote this book about the disillusionment of the war, how they all went off, being pumped up to serve the fatherland, and they came home utterly changed. Those who did come home, millions did not. And they made a movie out of this book in the 30s, which is considered a classic, not just a classic war movie, but a classic movie, period. 1930, I think it was released, All Quiet on the Western Front. It's black and white, and it's terrifying. It's extraordinarily powerful. And man, some of the footage that they shot and created was really scary. Give you a picture of what this experience was like. And I can't describe it because how could I? I've only read about it, Anyways, they remade this movie for TV in 1979, starring, of all people, John Boy Walton. Do you remember the Waltons, that kind of feel-good family, Heartland America show, the Waltons? Good night, John Boy. And John Boy, who was Richard Earl Thomas, the actor, played the role of Paul Bauman, this character who begins as a high school student or whatever, maybe a college student, whatever it was. Young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and the war breaks out, and we must defend the fatherland, and glory to Germany, and it's really compelling. This is told from the German side, but the story could very easily translate to the other side too. Same experience, man. And off he goes to the war, and there's one of the most famous scenes probably in cinema history, where the character Paul is in no man's land, and he finds his way into a shell hole to hide, under fire or whatever. And a French soldier jumps into the shell hole with him, and it's just the two of them, two men in this shell hole with the chaos happening around them. And Paul stabs the French guy because it's war, and if I don't kill you, you're going to kill me, And he stabs him, right? Bayonet or knife, whatever it is, the whole thing. And then has to spend the next X number of hours under the darkness in the worst place you could be. It's death everywhere, and it's mud, and it's rats, and it's this horrendous situation. The French guy is dying for hours, right? And Paul is beset by this extraordinary guilt, as you would be, and tries to comfort him, and he tries to give him water, and he tries to bandage the wound, and then the French guy's got I think a photo of his family, and it's just, put yourself in the position, man. Put yourself in this chaos. And I do this to myself too much. I shouldn't do this. Where I'll just put myself in the position of being in the line in the First World War, and how, I don't know how, people's nerves did break. They broke all the time, and they shot them for it. Unbelievable. A different time, different people. Anyways, Paul has to sit there all night with this guy dying who he stabbed, and eventually he does. And Paul, ages throughout the course of this couple of years, of his life in the line, and becomes this really embittered, war-weary veteran, becomes a broken kind of man, as probably most of them did. And I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but it's a First World War film, so, brace yourself. And I watched this on TV with my dad, and it hung with me forever. I could not look away from this movie I was watching at 6 years old. It was made for TV, so it was not all Private Ryan, okay? Now, the first 20 minutes of Private Ryan are a cinematic spectacle, the likes of which probably has never been duplicated. And it's intense, man. And there's some scary stuff in the 79 All Quiet on the Western Front, and there's some graphic stuff, but TV. So, it's not going to destroy a 6-year-old watching necessarily. But the last scene of that movie hung with me from the time I was 6 years old. And the combination of that and The Great Pumpkin hooked me hard on the First World War, and it has remained a fascination for me ever since. And so, in 2008, I went finally to some of these places, Ypres, Belgium, where just awful, awful, awful stuff happened, and Tynecott Cemetery outside of Passchendaele, where there are 10,000 Commonwealth soldiers buried, and some Germans, by the way, I think. And for me, it's been a fascination, and Remembrance Day brings that around every time, And so what I'm going to say to you on this Remembrance Day, for everybody really, I mean, we're talking 100 years ago now, it's like the animosity, at least from our side, probably from Canadians, if they even think about it at all anymore, which most people don't, and they should. It's just an historical thing now. We probably don't look back at it with a whole lot of kind of emotional attachment or engagement. But if you want to learn a little bit more about what we're actually remembering, Canadians might know a bit about Vimy, and I marched up the long slope to Vimy, to where the Canadian Memorial is, and it's really something, man. All those places, the Vimy Memorial and Beaumont Hamel, where on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, something like 850 Newfoundlanders went over the top, and less than 200 of them came back. And they were all cut to pieces within minutes, advancing over open terrain against German positions that it was thought were destroyed, but were not. And that was the day that roughly 60,000 British soldiers were wounded, 20,000 of them killed. And you go stand in some of those places. You stand on the ground. The trenches are still there. The shell holes at Vimy are still there. And you can't go near them, really. There are large swaths of the Vimy Memorial, the park there, that are roped off, man. You can't set foot on there. Why? Because there's so much live ammunition still there. Buried in the ground. Dud shells that are still extraordinarily volatile. And you can't go there. So you can see the land. The shell holes are all still there. It's preserved. It's grown over with grass now. It doesn't look like it did in 1917. But you can get a sense of it. And mine craters are still there. And you look way down into these mine craters, and you're like, how many people blew up when they blew this thing? And you can stand in the lines, and you can, like, the enemy line was right there. It was 100 yards away. Like, it's stunning. And you stand in these places and you get a sense. Only a sense. A sense is all you can get. Beaumont Hamel, you can stand in the trenches that the Newfoundlanders rose up out of. They're still there. They don't look like they did then. They're eroding a little bit. The barbed wire is still there in some of these places. You can stand there and you can look and you can sense it. And you can go to places, cemeteries, obviously, and those are, meticulously maintained and preserved. And you can go in Ypres in Belgium to the Menin Gate, which is this massive gate to the city where they have inscribed on it the names of missing British soldiers, of which there are tens and tens of thousands. So something like 70,000 names inscribed on the Menin Gate of men missing in action, presumably blown to bits or buried somewhere, or were buried and then got blown up, when fighting shifted. It's a gruesome tale, man. And it's not uplifting, but you can go to the Menin Gate, and every night they do a ceremony at the Menin Gate. Every night they play the last post. And we got to go and experience that. 100 years later, they still honor those sacrifices. They still remember. Remembrance Day is every day at the Menin Gate, you know? And it affects me. So if you're looking for something to dig into just a little bit about the First World War, which is where Remembrance Day stems from, you might watch either of the All Quiet on the Western Front movies. The 1930s one is pretty powerful, and the 1979 colorized television one with John Boy Walton, which was formative for me. You might look at that. That's the German perspective, but again, you know, same experience on both sides. And go listen to Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon. This is Dan Carlin runs the Hardcore History podcast, which is, you know, I don't know if there's a podcast Hall of Fame, but he's a first ballot Hall of Famer, all right? Now, he does these extremely long-form history shows, right? And he releases like 1 or 2 episodes a year. That's how much goes into producing one of these things. The research and the recording. You know, each episode is 3 or 4 hours long. It's an investment of time, man, but the content is absolutely outstanding. And his Blueprint for Armageddon series is 5 or 6 episodes, 3-4 hours each. We're talking over 20 hours of in-depth, extraordinarily compelling. Dan Carlin's a great presenter. He's got a great voice, and he's got a great way of delivering his content, right? He'll suck you in, man. If you're remotely interested in the First World War, go listen to Blueprint for Armageddon, which is Dan Carlin's series on the First World War. Now, I've listened to the entire thing front to back probably 4 times. And there's stuff that leaps out to me every time that I didn't think of before. An exceptionally well done series on that conflict. And it doesn't just cover the Americans or the British or the French or the Russians or whatever. It's global, all right? It's the whole thing. And it was pretty global. Maybe not as global as World War II, but still pretty global. Still pretty world, you know what I'm saying? So go listen to that and go watch Eric Remarquez stuff. You could look at the Passchendaele movie. The Passchendaele movie was Paul Gross's movie about, well, in name about the Battle of Passchendaele, although it wasn't really. But Canadian perspective, some pretty intense battle scenes in that. If you want to get, I don't know, a picture in your mind of what it might have been like a little bit. Some people debate whether those battle scenes were really accurate. I'm not gonna go there. I don't know. I wasn't at the battle, but compelling Canadian movie if you want to look at it, the Canadian side. But you know, if you're a Remembrance Day person and you want to dig in a little bit more about that stuff, that's what I'm recommending. All Quiet on the Western Front, and either of them, and Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon. And what he's talking about when he says that is Armageddon is World War II, okay? And so he's calling World War I the blueprint for that. And by the time you get to the end of World War I, what you have is prototype of the armies that will fight World War II. So in a certain sense, it is. But I'm not going to dig into that because we're over an hour here. And if you've hung with me through the war stuff, my hat is off to you, man. I know that lately I've been talking about some lighter fare, and I intend to go back to that. But as tomorrow is Remembrance Day, it's important to me, and the First World War is a thing for me, and I still remain fascinated by it, and I still study it all the time. And, you know, it's not all music all the time, and it's not all motivation all the time, but I'll remind you again, you have the creative spark, my friends. Use it. Indulge it. You know, 2020, hopefully in hindsight, hopefully with our own 2020, we'll look back and say this is the year that everything changed for the better for a lot of us. I know it's not going to be that way for everyone. I know this is extremely rough for a lot of people. But you have the spark in you to do something, man. So follow it. If what you normally do has been taken away, here's your opportunity to indulge something else. Here's your opportunity to take a chance on something that you've maybe never had the time or the inclination to take on before. So try to see it as that. I'm trying to see it as that. I want to thank you for hanging with me this long. I hope you're still here. I hope the war section didn't put you off. And go to Vienna if you can. If we can ever travel again, go to Vienna, or at least look at pictures. Look at travelogues. Look at Paris. Look at Berlin. Look at Amsterdam. It's just, Cities are wonderful, man, and history is wonderful too. So go do those things. Try not to let 2020 get you down. Try to see the opportunities. I'm trying to do it. It's tough. But, I don't know. Maybe the election down south is the beginning of a swing in some direction. But I know there are people out there who are going to argue with me about that. And I do not want to have that discussion. So I'm going to say goodbye for now. Thanks for hanging. And I'll be back next week, and maybe I'll try my best not to talk about things like Passchendaele. Bye for now, kids. Talk to you soon. Thank you once again, gentle listener, for taking in today's show. If you want to know more about the program, go to www.john-huff.com. That's JOHN-HUFF.com and click on podcast. You can also find the show on Facebook at The John Huff Podcast. If you're an Instagram person, you can find me at JW_Huff. If you're a Twitter person, you can find me at JWSHuff. No matter where you listen to the show, please do me a big, big favor and leave a rating and review. Preferably a positive one. That's all the time we have for today, but I'll be back very soon. Until then, keep your wits about you, and remember, good things happen when you put yourself out there. Bye for now. Incidentally, great coffee in Vienna, great Belgian waffles in Belgium. Go get 'em, kids.